Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for joining us today for this program on the enslavement of Africans. We have Dr. Aslam Abdullah as my co-moderator, and Imam Fateen has just joined us on this. Just a few words from me on introduction, and then we have Imam Fateen speak to us on the subject. I just want to give a picture of sort of before Africa, before I would say European slavery. And I was born in Tanzania. I have dealt with the Chaga chiefs. I have dealt with, various chiefs at that time, and some of the history that I have read at the same time. I've experienced this having born in Africa. So the people of particularly West Africa that we are referring to had a rich and a varied history and culture long before the Europeans was arrived. And they had a wide variety of political arrangements, including kingdoms, city-states, and each had their own language and their own culture. And this is sometimes not realized as to how rich the African culture was. For example, the empire of Songhai, the kingdom of Mali, Benin, were large and powerful kingdoms with monarchs heading complex political structures governing hundreds of thousands of subjects. There was art, there was learning, flourished within the African, the Quranic learning, for example. They were skilled in subjects like medicine, mathematics, astronomy. As well as manufacturing, goods in bronze, ivory, gold, and all that. And this myth, in terms of saying that we are going to bring civilization to Africa, needs to be explored, and we hope that programs of this nature will actually better inform us as to where the African continent was at that time. We also know that the West Africans had traded with Europeans through merchants in North Africa for centuries. But from their first context, the European traders obviously kidnapped and brought Africans for sale to Europe, and the rest is history that we will learn today. And with those sort of just that painting that visage, that it was from this background, the entire issue of slavery, European slavery in particular, begins. And with that said, I would like to invite Dr. Aslam to informally introduce our speaker today, Imam Fateen. And then we will have Imam Fateen speak to us for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion in terms of some questions that we may have and some observations. Dr. Aslam, please.
Thank you very much. Imam Saifullah Fateen comes from the trenches. He grew up in the streets. He cleaned the streets, and then he is rebuilding a community, a village of those people whom he cleaned. He's from Las Vegas, the Imam of Masjid, as-Sabur, one of the most popular leaders in the city, who has made a tremendous contribution, not only within the Muslim community, but also in the interfaith community of greater Nevada and in the country as a whole. One of the remarkable things is that together with his friends and together with his colleagues, he is now building a village which would be called, or which is being called, the Muslim village, where those people who have been living on the periphery and on the margins of the society, who had lost hope of having a decent life and a dignified life, are coming together, rebuilding themselves, rebuilding their community, and making a contribution to the society as a whole. Dr. Fateen also organizes a number of voluntary and humanitarian causes throughout the city, where the people who are poor and who are needy are being provided not only medical services, but also food and shelter and many other things. And of course, he is the Imam of the the Masjid as-Sabur last year during the COVID. He lost his beloved wife and he lost his son as well. And certainly, due to the restrictions attending the funerals, many of us who would want it to be there could not attend. So we offer our condolences to him and we offer prayer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They give Janatul Firdaus to Sister Anisa and to Imam Fateen's son. Please, with that, welcome Imam Fateen for his presentation that we are all looking forward to.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings that only Allah can give be with you and with us all. Thank you so much, Dr. Aslam, in particular for reaching out to us and being a mentor really for a number of years. We're very, very grateful and appreciative. And I would like to begin by saying that we're grateful to you and to Dr. Hussain and Islamic City for providing such a platform. My primary purpose for accepting to share some words while acknowledging that I'm not qualified, I'm not a historian, but I am a descendant of slaves. I can trace my history back. My great-great-great-grandmother was a slave. You know, my great-great-grandmother talked about her experiences. My great-grandmother and grandmother, they also talked about their experiences coming out of slavery. And so I'm accepting to talk to you all and to share what I know about this history, not as a historian, but as a product of that institution, in the sense that I'm 3, 4, 5 generations or so away from it. And also, whenever Dr. Aslam calls, I want to be able to respond because he always responds when I call him. In addition, I'd like to say, in quoting one of my brothers, Imam Dawood Walid, who said that we live in a time of unprecedented access to information. So my approach won't be that of a historian. In fact, what I'll do through the course of it is kind of reference some books that I would suggest that you read at your own leisure. Some of the recordings that you can listen to from the Library of Congress. And so I'll just share some stories here and there. But even though we live in this period of tremendous access to information, there's also this period of misinformation. And so it gives us an opportunity to kind of share and to address some of the important matters. You know, when we think about this particular time, as we're talking about it, alhamdulillah, that we're talking about it during this time of Muharram, you know, thinking about the legacy of Imam Hussain, you know, and I listened to the first day in which our speaker, he reminded us of Imam Hussein's cry out, "Is there any helper who will help?" And so this is not just a reflection on the history of the past, but it gives us some insight into how to work going forward. And so I would like to say some historians, when they talk about slavery, they say it was 400 years. Others say 250 years. Whether we agree that it was 250 years or 400 years, the treatment and abuse that took place was real. The injustice was real. And it was one of the greatest sustained acts of oppression that history has known. Imam Hussain is quoted as saying, "God will help the person who cares about other people's needs, both in this world and in the hereafter." And he's also quoted as saying, "Avoid oppressing the one who does not have any supporter against you other than Allah." And as our Sheikh Dr. Hussain Walji, he mentioned Imam Hussain saying, "Is there any helper who will help?" reminds me of what Allah says in the Quran when he reminds us And what is the matter with you that you fight not in the cause of Allah and for the oppressed among men, women, and children who say, our Lord, take us out of this city of oppressive people and appoint for us from yourself a protector and appoint for us from yourself a helper. What Dr. Walji and Dr. Aslam are doing along with Islamic City is answering that call by bringing attention to the plight of those marginalized communities who still suffer from the impact of systemic forms of discrimination. This topic, the enslavement of Africans, could be understood to address various forms of slavery that has taken place during the long history of African civilization. One could easily reflect on the capturing of one tribe during war, or even the conquering of lands in Africa that led to slavery in one context. In truth, different forms of servitude has long been features of many African societies. And Africa has long established slave systems and slave routes, such as those across the Sahara Desert, along the Nile. These systems differ drastically with what the transatlantic slave trade and racialized slave movement produced. The same could be said about the Arabs who enslaved Africans. We could go down that route and talk about its history, or even today with what is taking place in modern times in places like Libya or in Mauritania and parts of Asia. The fact that there are 40 million entrapped in slavery today, 1 in 4 children, more than 2/3 women, and according to the statistics, the most prevalent places are Africa, followed by Asia. Again, though, one of the most brutal forms of slavery in modern time was the capturing of slaves and transporting them from one area in Africa, sometimes walking, making the slaves walk for days, sometimes even months to be held in squalor. I had the good fortune and the tremendous burden on my spirit to visit one of those holding places in Senegal. They call it Gory Island, where they would hold the people until they would transport them across the Atlantic. And what's really interesting when you visit such places is that you feel all of its gloom and all of its darkness. And you think about how far they were made to travel on foot, in shackles, in chains, with ropes, abused, sick. And then when you go into those holding places that would make claustrophobic 2 or 3 people, and they were placing dozens upon dozens inside of there. And you could feel the darkness and the gloom when you reach in and when you get into those areas. But even worse than that, those who were sick, those who were near death, they weren't allotted an opportunity to be buried, or in many instances, they were Muslims, or to be prayed over. Their bodies were thrown into the Atlantic because the door of no return, it was literally a door that opened up into the Atlantic. It was built right up on the coast. And historians and the people of Senegal in particular, they talk about this area around the Atlantic Ocean, right up on the shore, where sharks were known to come closer than ever before because they would feed on those bodies of the sick, and the dying, and those who had died already. They would just be thrown into the water. And so that was the beginning of their journey, their torturous trek across the Atlantic Ocean. You might say the brutality began long before they entered into the ships. And when they got into the ships, they were packed in like sardines. And you can see read enough books and watch enough videos and kind of put yourself in a position to see and understand that it wasn't a luxury cruise. That in fact, these people were being sandwiched in there, unable to move, shackled, urinating and defecating on themselves, and being put in a position where disease upon disease would affect and impact them. That so many of them would die just coming across the Atlantic Ocean. That the brutality of those, the enslavers, the capturers, the transporters, It was so brutal. They didn't see any humanity in the people that they were bringing across the Atlantic. And so this 30-day or 60-day trip across the Atlantic would see more deaths. More of them would die beneath the hulls of the slave ship. Some of them would be thrown over. Some of them would die and their remains would make it to the shores. You know, and one of the other things that historians now say about this experience is that they didn't go right from their homeland and the slave ships to the Americas. They didn't go right to the United States of America. They didn't go right into the plantations in Georgia or in Mississippi or in Louisiana or in South Carolina. But they would stop literally in places that they call almost seasoning camps, you know, in Brazil and in other places. And this is where they would begin to break the slave even more. Even if you thought that the capture and the detainment on the shores of Africa was bad, and you thought that the journey and the mistreatment and the malnutrition and the brutality and the beatings was bad on the slave ship, they still felt the need to break them even more. So they would have what is now, they refer to them as seasoning camps or stops, where they would beat them, break them, program them, prepare them for a life of servitude. The major transporters of slaves were the Portuguese, the British, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the Danish. Several of them had outposts on the African coast. And as we mentioned, after initial capture, African slavers might pass them through different African societies, through alien lands and cultures for weeks, months, and according to this historian, he said even years before confronting the most confusing sight, European men, the Atlantic Ocean, and the slave ships. When we think about these acts of oppression and why it's so important to talk about it today, I would say in part because of some of the terms that are being introduced to us now. There's a widespread attempt to, they say, sanitize what took place, sanitize the language by referring to slavery as involuntary relocation. It's forced migration. And to coin the phrase now, they keep referencing critical race theory, or the fact that they don't want our children to know about this vicious, inhumane treatment that Blacks receive. It makes one admire what the Jewish community has done in terms of never letting people forget the Holocaust. Platforms like this give us a chance to talk about just a little bit of what took place in what they call chattel slavery. You know, the world has always known some form of slavery, but what USA plantation style, American slavery, was much more brutal, and it was much more deliberate in terms of its economic benefits. You know, so they say chattel slavery is this system which allows people to be considered as property. The African, he was considered as a third of two-thirds human, or he was like cattle, just a little above, but he could be bought and sold. And they mention the selling blocks when historians talk about what took place. They talk about the prodding and the poking and the opening of the mouths like you're dealing with animals, and the checking the body parts and trying to determine who's the most fertile, who will produce the most babies, and whether these babies will be strong enough to work the fields, whether they will be strong enough to bear the burden of slavery. So this took place from the 16th century to the 18th century. And when we talk about slavery in America, one of the most troubling aspects for me was the level of hypocrisy. The founding fathers who composed such an eloquent document about liberty and freedom were also the owners of slaves. This level of hypocrisy compelled one of our freedom fighters, Frederick Douglass, to give a speech that mirrors Imam Hussein's address in many ways, because it was a challenge to the oppressors. He said, "Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today?" It was a 4th of July address. "What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in the Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar?" He said, "Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wails of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, or today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember these bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To force them to pass lightly over their wrongs and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason most scandalous." Frederick Douglass was just one of them who talked about the brutality of slavery and also the hypocrisy of a system that would speak about freedom and equality and justice, but that would allow people to be brutalized in such ways. I apologize for not providing any visuals for this presentation, but what I would like to do is recommend a couple of books. Ira Berlin, she writes, "Many Thousands Gone, the First 2 Centuries of Slavery in North America." Stephanie Camp, she writes, "Closer to Freedom, Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South." Walter Johnson, he writes, "Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market." And again, as we mentioned, the Library of Congress has recorded testimonies of former slaves. You can hear their voices. An outstanding study of 2 periods. When they talk about this history of slavery, we mentioned from 1600s, but they said from 1450 to 1600, there were 400,000 across the Atlantic. 1601 to 1700, 1 million. 1701 to 1800, 6 million. 1801 to 1667, 3 million, bringing the total to about 12 million. And they say, according to most historians, 30% of them were Muslims. The enforced migration of Africans to the Americas in conditions of slavery lasted from the middle of the 16th century into 1860. It was known as the vicious or the notorious Middle Passage. I thought it'd be interesting for you to hear. There's another book that we actually took from that I'd like to share just a little with you. But when we think about Muslims and what they witnessed and knew of slavery, and their inability to act is inconsistent with our beloved Imam Hussain, but also with the Khalifa Mu'tasim Billah. You know, many of you all, you know the story. You know, we want people like that. We want people who speak up and challenge the people in power or the people of oppression. And so as the report goes, and I just wanted to share this to give us a kind of look into what kind of people we're trying to raise or that we need to raise in order to create some balance and harmony in the society. It was reported that one woman was captured by the Romans. And when she cried out, "Where are you?" crying out to the Khalifa, when the word got back to him, he wrote a letter to the people of Rome. And what did he say to them? He said, "If you don't release her, I will send an army so large that when it reaches your gate, the last one wouldn't have left my kingdom yet." That was somebody who was concerned about one person's oppression. What about 11 million? The factors that define slavery, when we think about it, is the social, political, and economic purpose. So slaves were made to bear the burden of building this beautiful country. I went to DC just recently, The White House itself were built by slaves. You find all of these institutions that built the wealth of other nations that were built by slaves, and people still tend to look and ask the question, what's going on with the African Americans? My favorite point of reference, and I'll conclude with this, is a book entitled American Slavery as It Is, Testimonies of 1,000 Witnesses. And this was a collection of articles from slaves, preachers, white preachers, former slave owners, family members of former slave owners, and all of them talked about the brutality. And just a few of them, I wanted to kind of present this different than just a historical account of what took place. We know that there was raping, that there was murdering, that there was chopping off of limbs, that there was whipping posts in which they beat them from one point of day until close to nighttime, and then sent them back out into the fields. All of that took place, but I wanted you to hear from some of the witnesses. Mr. Calkin, a white man who felt it is his duty to tell something that I know about slavery. He said, the scenes that I have witnessed are enough horror to impact the soul. But could the slave be permitted to tell the story of his suffering, which no white man not linked with slavery is allowed to know? He said the land would vomit out the horrible system. They were made to live in cabins or huts that the slaves built on Sundays, or built by moonlight nights by going out into the swamp to cut logs. He said, I once saw Harry, a slave, restrained in a box, flogged every morning for a week, dragged to the field to work all day, and then put down in the restraints up to the ankles at night. Reverend Horace Moulton, he said, he was a minister of Methodist Episcopal Church who spent 5 years in Georgia in a brick making factory, for lack of a better word. He said the rule was to work them from sun up to sundown, but the feeble, unskilled ones had a very hard time, and for non-compliance, they would end up at the whipping post. The food of the slaves, according to one account, was 1/46 of the free man. In Georgia and South Carolina, these miserable huts the poor blacks are herded into like swines. He said, God alone knows how much the poor slaves suffered for the want of convenient housing to secure them from piercing wind. Mr. Poe, a native of Richmond, he said, a former slaveholder, he said he was for several years a merchant in Richmond and subsequently in Lynchburg, Virginia. A few years since, he emancipated his slaves. He says, I am pained exceedingly, and nothing but my duty to God, to the oppressors, and to the poor downtrodden who go mourning all their days could move me to say a word. I will state to you a few cases of the abuse. In Goochland County, he says, an overseer tied a slave to a tree, flogged him again and again with great severity, then piled brushes around him and set him on fire and burned him to death. The slave suffering from inhumane neglect when sick. He says, Dr. Channing of Boston, who once resided in Virginia, related the following. I cannot forget my feelings on visiting hospitals belonging to the plantation. When I entered the hospital with him, the first object on which my eyes was to fall was a young woman, very ill, probably approaching death. She was stretched on the floor. Her head rested on something like a pillow. But he said the most disheartening part was how accustomed they were of walking past them as though they didn't see them at all. Not feeling the pain, not viewing them as human, but viewing them as cattle who could be replaced. He says when a slave was to be punished, there was one slave owner, when he would punish his slaves, he would invite his friends over for wine, and they would play cards, and every now and then he would taunt the slave as he was being beaten. This was slavery, USA plantation style. And the last thing that I would mention is Miss Grimm. She's a daughter of the late Judge Grimke of the Supreme Court of South Carolina and the sister of the late Honorable Thomas Grimke. She states, as I left my native state on account of slavery and deserted the homes of my father to escape the sound of the lash and the shrieks of tortured victims, I would gladly bury in oblivion the recollection of those scenes with which I found. She described the beatings, the rapes, and the brutality. And in those testimonies from the Library of Congress, you hear from the slave himself who talked about how Massa beat him, how he deprived him of food, how he worked him from sunup to sundown. And so, my dear brothers and sisters, some of the witnesses, as opposed to just talking to you about the history itself. There's enough books. I cited some of them. I pray that it was helpful and gives us an opportunity to see what's needed, what was needed then and what's needed today, which is people who take a stand for people who are oppressed and marginalized. Forgive me, I'm operating from my phone and it fell, but may God bless you and reward you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imam Fateen, for this wonderful elucidation of what has happened in the last several centuries, and the world has witnessed it silently. I would like to add 3 additional points to basically echo what you have been saying. The first is that the Muslims in general have remained apathetic to the issue of slavery and to the plight of slaves. Muslims in the past were as responsible for promoting slavery as you can blame Christians and Jews and many others. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Aden or these waterways that were controlled by the Turkish empires were all controlled by Muslims. And yet the ships after ships moved from there carrying these millions of slaves, and nobody stood up and nobody questioned the legitimacy of that kind of practice. Not only that, but name me those few Muslim scholars who did not have slaves in their own homes. You may say that they were benevolent. You may say that they were kind. You may say that the slavery was different, but slavery, no matter what form and what shape it takes, is anti-divine, anti-human. When you consider a human being, subhuman, then you basically are interfering in the divine scheme. Quran is very specific. Quran very clearly says that no human being can take any other human being as slaves. And Quran says that from now on, all the avenues for slavery are being closed because slavery came into being as a result of prisoners of war who were taken as captives and were treated as slaves, or either you free them or you without any compensation, or you free them with compensation. So slavery was abolished, yet the Muslim societies continue to practice it. And until as early as 1971, there were slave markets outside Mecca, the house of God, where women and men were being sold as slaves. And they were the ones who came from Africa, mostly from Africa. Even today in Mauritania, even today in Libya, as you mentioned, this kind of practice. And there are scholars who are justifying it, and there are people who are saying that slavery, was not totally abolished, despite the fact that the Quran says that fakku raqaba, that the responsibility is to make sure that the slaves or those people who are under bondage are freed. So that's one point, that Muslims by and large have remained apathetic to the issue of slavery in their literature. Even the presence and reference in our fiqh book that the slaves are not supposed to offer Friday prayer is basically an insult to the believers. It is an insult to that idea of a free human being. The second thing is that the Muslim community as a whole, in general, have neglected the plight of the African American Muslims and African Americans in general as a whole. Allow me to say that the African Americans, perhaps the only community within the Muslim community after the struggle of Imam Hussain that has gone through the torture and the pain that no other Muslim community has gone through in the history of Islam. And millions have perished, and millions have lost their humanity, and millions suffered as a result of that apathy. And Muslims, whether during the colonial period or after colonial period, did not have the audacity to stand for their rights and did not have the courage to question the Europeans. Look at how the people in the Middle East aligned with the Europeans in order to gain their own political power without even questioning the practice of this kind of slavery. And the third thing is that even today, racism is rampant among Muslims. All you need to do is to visit those places where, based on the skin of the color, you basically have discrimination. And one simple example and one simple test is that look at the relief agencies in this country also. 90% of the relief goes not to Africa, where the greatest poverty prevails, but to places where most of the immigrants came. 90% of the people who are living in the inner city, including Muslims, do not get what the Muslim community raised in this country. It's a matter of perspective, it's a matter of consciousness. So certainly when we talk about the slavery of Africa, yes, we know that the first slaves, the first pilgrims came, and those who were brought in the first ship as slaves was called Jesus. But we also acknowledge that our response to the slavery has not been what Imam Hussain would have wanted us to, what Allah would have wanted us to, what our Prophet would have wanted us to. And then we certainly have to look at ourselves from that perspective and ask the question that why did we allow it to happen for so long? For almost 300 years, Muslim conscience is dead as far as the slavery is concerned.
Dr. Aslam, I would also like to add to that point that Muslims could gain benefit from attaching themselves to not just the history of resistance to slavery, but the reality is 20-30% of the population that came here were Muslims. It would be even advantageous to say, when people say, go back to your home, go back to your land, to be able to say, we were here before many of you. But to speak to kind of like the level of racism and discrimination Muslims would forego attaching themselves to Muslims of the 18th century, the 19th century, for fear of being attached to something beneath them. So we have to change the mind of Muslims as it relates to how they view this former slaves, how they view the slaves, the former slaves, and even this generation, the people living during these times. If you see them as subhuman, and if you see them as people who are justifiably weaker or should be abused or can experience police brutality, and you turn a blind eye to it because they're not really human anyway, is the mindset that we seem to be encountering among Muslims and other people, non-blacks. And so we have to keep raising these kind of arguments and conversations about both not just the humanity that's being abused and neglected, but also the fact that you can tie yourself to a history that makes your coming to these lands before 65. You know, you're coming to these lands before 1920, and the Syrians and the other ones who went into the factories in Detroit or in the Midwest. You could tie yourself to this history that goes back to even before Columbus. But that's difficult to do if you see Black people as subordinate.
Dr. Balji, your take on that?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Aslam and Imam Fateen, for really elucidating the situation as it prevailed. And it gives us a good glimpse, and thank you for also pointing out those books. I'd like to take our focus and take a torchlight and look at ourselves in the mirror today. Yes, Dr. Aslam, you're absolutely correct. You know, why did people not rise up? Why did they allow this to happen? And these are very valid questions. My question is that the call of Imam Hussain is timeless, it's universal. And today, what we see in our country, the restrictions on free people of color, limiting their mobility and their ability to act as citizens, have powerful echoes today. The efforts to suppress voting, restrict immigration, and enforce criminal laws through practices like stop and frisk and all that. We see that, especially within communities of color, are all remnants of that system.
Yes.
And that's been justified on the basis of degradation, subordination, by the presumption of say, criminality based on your color and race, as Imam Fateen also just alluded to. My question is that as we think about our political future in this country, this history lives on. And what can we do to ensure that the ideals of freedom, equality, justice for all Americans is done? Because 200 years down the line, people will be having the same conversation about us to say, what did they do? And this is something that we need to be mindful of, to say that we have a responsibility, because that call by Imam Hussain is as relevant as it was then, as relevant as it was 400 years ago at the time of slavery. It is as relevant today for us when we have these inequities in our country that is staring us in the face. And that's something that we need to continue. Over to you, Dr. Aslam.
Imam Fateen, your take on what is being raised by Dr. Balji?
Yes, sir. I certainly appreciate the call. The call is the call of Imam Hussain, who says, if there any helper who will help, this is not ancient history. As the doc pointed out, we're witnessing it in all of those areas that he pointed out. And one of the things that I would hope that we would do is take our time when analyzing and assessing what we hope our future to be, and not look for expedient, quick results that make life easy for our family, but think about humanity. And I think that's what has happened, and that's part of what we're witnessing in the Muslim community. Everybody is thinking about themselves and how they protect and preserve their tribe or their family. And if we took the approach of Imam Hussain, then we would think about humanity as a whole. Because when we didn't, when we failed, even as it relates to these most recent elections, we watched the federal courts turn, we watched the Supreme Court turn, because in many instances, we were thinking, this one is good for my bank account. This politician is good for my livelihood. And we weren't forward enough thinkers to think what 30 years down the road would look like when the same Supreme Court justices are still in place, eroding civil liberties. So as a Muslim body, we have such great examples. We have our Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we have Imam Ali, we have Imam Hussain, we have Khalifas like Mu'tasim. We have examples to follow to advance the cause for the good of humanity. But if we ignore those models and examples, and we search out modern day expedient examples from people who have no faith and no God consciousness, then we will be 200 years from now indicted just like the group before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that need to happen is that there has to be increased interaction among those who claim themselves to be immigrants and those who have been native in the sense that they were in this country even before Columbus. And that interaction has to be in the direction of not only economic and financial development, but also in educational field and also in the social spheres. And certainly there has to be some mechanisms, some institutions that should promote those kind of things. We find that there are Muslim organizations that hold their annual conventions, the ISNA, the ICNA, the MAS, and then the African Americans also hold their annual convention. And it looks funny when you see people focusing on a universal phase from the perspective of a very sectarian mindset, ignoring the realities and ignoring the history in this country, and ignoring the contributions that the Muslim made in terms of living Islam in this particular phase. So I think this is perhaps is the need of the hour, and I hope that Imam Fateen, being in the trenches, you would take the lead in this area, and certainly we are all with you for this wonderful project that is the need of the hour. But again, I think the other thing that I think I would also like to clarify is that during this particular series of the 10 days, we only have a few cases like the Africans, like the indigenous tribes. We would talk about the Palestinians, we would talk about the people in Uyghur, and so on and so forth. We could not include everyone in our discussions because we know the list is very long and we have very limited resources. But this is a series that we would like to work on a regular basis so that we could at least be a witness to ourselves that we were not silent when we came to know about the sufferings of those people. And we at least said what needs to be said, and we at least did whatever we could do in these circumstances. We wish we had more opportunities and more resources to really stand up for those people and stop all these oppression anywhere in the world. But we, within the limitations that we have, at least make a noise and can say that we Muslims, both Shias and the Sunnis, the blacks, the non-blacks, the whites, the yellows, whatever you want to call them, we are one in terms of living the legacy of Imam Hussain when it comes to standing up for justice and when it comes to fighting the oppression, no matter who the oppressors are and who the victims of injustices are. Dr. Balji, back to you.
Thank you very much. I think a point very well made. It reminds me of that lizard who was trying to put out the fire for Nabi Ibrahim. And when the lizard was asked to say, what will it do with this one drop? And he said, at least on the day of judgment, I'll tell my maker that I tried. And that is something that we all, that's all we can do. And inshallah, we should continue. And your leadership, Imam Fateen, your leadership, Dr. Aslam Abdullah, I think we need many voices, many leaders like you, in our nation to ensure that we continue to remind people of our responsibilities in standing up for a just cause. And that, as we said before, that we must not just witness, but we must become witnesses to the and move on. With that, I'll pass you back to Dr. Aslam and to Imam Fateen for a couple of remarks and dua.
Yes, and before I hand it over to Imam Fateen for his concluding remarks, followed by the dua that he would make, I'd like to announce that tomorrow we would be focusing on, and don't be surprised, on the Jewish diaspora, on the persecution of Jews by the powers be in the past. And two rabbis are invited, yes, tomorrow to talk about the destruction of the first temple, and they would also talk about the displacement of the Jewish community and the continuous pogroms and the continuous kind of holocausts that have basically inflicted upon that community. And it is in the spirit of the Quran that you be a witness against all those who commit injustices, no matter what the faith of the other people is. And then followed by tomorrow, we would have Sister Hidab Tarifi talking about the Palestinian tragedy, that how come those people who suffered so immensely in the history became the oppressors themselves, and let a people be robbed of their dignity and their freedom and their liberty. And certainly these are the two very interesting segments that we would have it. Then after that, we would have the segment on South Africa and the apartheid. Then we would go to Uyghur Muslims, where we would have the president of the Uyghur Muslim Society to talk about the situation in China. And then we would have Dr. Ahmadullah Siddiqui talk about the Muslims in Myanmar and the Muslims in India who are facing an attempted genocide in our modern times. And then lastly, on the last day, with the inclusion of Brother Abbas, one of the best academicians in our times, based in Washington, we would be discussing between Dr. Walji, Dr. Abbas, and myself that how we should use all this information that we have to carve out a future of action for all of us, including the people of different ethnicities, different cultures, and different sects. So with that, I once again grateful to Imam Fateen for taking his time out. I know it's time for prayer in his masjid, but please give your concluding remarks and conclude it with the dua. And Dr. Walji, then you can conclude it with the thanks and concluding words.
Assalamu alaikum. May God's peace and blessings be upon the listening audience and all of you all. Again, Dr. Walji and Dr. Abdul Aslam, may Allah bless you in Islamic City for arranging such a inspirational set of days and series. If I may, I would just like to mention the Muslim Village, because it's in some ways the name of it throws people off. When we say Muslim Village, we're not saying Muslim exclusively. We're saying utilizing the values, and the principles of decency to create a village in the inner city that's helpful and supportive of anybody in need. And so we're grateful to be able to be on this platform to talk about what we love, and that's the service of humanity, helping those who are weak and oppressed, responding to the call like Imam Hussain has. May Allah be pleased with him. So I conclude by saying, may Allah bless you all, the organizers. May Allah bless those who manage the scenes behind the camera. May Allah strengthen the Muslims and give us insight and intestinal fortitude and strength and courage, that we may stand up to the oppressors, that we may respond to those who are weak and marginalized, wherever they are, whatever their condition is. May Allah make us people like Imam Hussain and those who surrounded themselves with him and offered their lives for truth, justice, and equality. May Allah make us people who adhere to the Quran and to the life example of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And may Allah help us that we may utilize our time here on earth, here in the United States of America, to help this country realize its highest values and to be contributors to the good and well-being of all of them. May Allah bless you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Ahsan, Jazakallah, Jazakallah, Imam Fateen. Ameen. Inshallah, we will be back tomorrow. In the meanwhile, it just remains for me to thank once again Imam Fateen to join us today. Dr. Aslam, for your leadership and your vision to be able for us to be able to put this program together, and nothing would have been possible had it not been for Brother Aleem to be able to facilitate this through Islamic City, and his wonderful IT and the tech team, Ajay and everybody else. We say thank you so very much. May Allah bless you for the work that you do. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.